Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this EPC policy dialogue, which is going to be looking at the recent summit between the US and Russian presidents that took place on the 16th of June in Geneva and its outcome. This get-together took place at a time when Russia-US relations are really at an all-time low. Russia has become, I think it's fair to say, extremely disruptive in international politics, using insecurity and unpredictability to increase its ability to influence world affairs, international relations. Now, the list of grievances from the point of view of Washington, and I would also say from the side of the European Union, seems to be very long, and perhaps even getting longer. And we can put in that list cyber attacks, interference into domestic spheres, particularly elections, Ukraine, Belarus, Alexei Navalny, Black Sea security. But this seems to have culminated in the emergence of a list of policy priorities in the two states' bilateral relations, in particular, strategic stability and cybersecurity. I mean, these seem to have been two of the main takeaways from the summit. But while the two leaders had some quite nice words to say about each other, or maybe they were being pragmatic, I think we can agree that at the two separate press conferences, it sort of revealed many disagreements on many of the issues that were actually discussed. So today we have more or less three or four key questions that we're going to be looking at. First of all, why did this summit take place and was it really necessary? Secondly, what was the main takeaways? Was anything really substantial agreed on? Or was it more about pie in the sky, as we say in the UK, which basically means wishful thinking? Thirdly, is there a genuine will from President Putin to seriously make progress on the issues that were discussed? I mean, Russia has already been accused of cyber attacks in the last few days. Russian hackers have been accused of breaching a contractor for the RNC last week. And last but not least, I mean, what does this summit and the possible outcome of it mean for the European Union, but also for the future of transatlantic cooperation on Russia? Today, we're really lucky because we have a fabulous panel of experts with us today to discuss these issues, who I'm going to briefly introduce now. First of all, Alina Polyakova, who's President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis in the United States. Secondly, Fyodor Lukyanov, Editor-in-Chief of Russia in Global Affairs and Chairman of the Presidium Council on Foreign and Defense Study. And last but not least, Jonathan Eyal, who's Associate Director, Strategic Research Partnerships and International Director at the Royal United Services Institute in London. To the audience, please can you put your questions either by clicking on the hand icon or by typing into the chat box. Please can you keep them quite short if possible, because otherwise it becomes very difficult to keep track of everything. And if you can you please start to put these questions from the beginning of this discussion so that I can sort of include them as we go along. So I'd like to start actually this discussion with a question to you, Alina. I mean, the White House largely ignored a request from President Putin earlier this year. I think it was in mid-March for a public face-to-face meeting. So why was it? I mean, was it because of the escalation on Ukraine's eastern border, where there was over 100,000 Russian troops, including with very heavy equipment? Was this the reason why there was a sort of rethink from President Biden about meeting with President Putin? That would be my first question. And as an add-on, what is your view of the actual outcome of the summit? and the future of US-Russia relations. So I give the floor to you first.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda. Those are very complex and important questions. I'll try to be brief in my answers, since I think I will really be keen to hear from all of the fantastic colleagues on this line, and certainly from the view from Moscow, from Fyodor, who's able to join us. Well, one, it's very clear that the administration, the Biden administration going in, had no intention to deal with Russia, had no desire to deal with Russia. Russia was definitely not a top priority. For everything we heard after the election of Joe Biden. It was China, it was climate change, it's rebuilding alliances, particularly with Europe and also in the Indo-Pacific. But as history has taught us, the Kremlin will make itself a priority if it is not officially one. And that's exactly what I think has happened very clearly. And the buildup, the military buildup on the border with Ukraine prompted initially the then visit of Secretary of State Blinken to Ukraine for a meeting with Ukraine's president and other officials. And quickly following that, there was this summit date announced that followed many of the meetings happening, the G7 with the EU partners and other coordination with allies. To my mind, the Kremlin played this incredibly well. I think they wanted this high-level meeting and they got it. It also seems to me that often these kinds of high-level summits are seen from Moscow as a great opportunity for PR to show Russia's role as a great power, at least on the world stage. It gives President Putin an opportunity to get his message to the entire world in a way that he doesn't always get to do in some of his own press conferences in Russia. So it's a great PR opportunity that is certainly the case. What do we get from it? I would say pretty much nothing. So I think there's one way to interpret this, which is that this could be seen, the summit could have been seen as a reward, or at least a legitimization of Russia's continued disruptive behavior, whether that be in Ukraine, whether that be by harboring terrorist like hacker organizations, or launching its own information campaigns and disinformation campaigns, as well as cyber attacks against the United States and various US allies as well. And I thought what was most worrisome is that shortly after the Putin-Biden meeting in Geneva, we saw the German Chancellor and the French President, President Macron and Chancellor Merkel, propose an EU-Russia dialogue. This is a dialogue that was cut off after Russia's invasion and continued occupation of Crimea. And that was showed how contentious and how divisive Russia policy is between European allies. Or we saw the Baltic states and Poland really put a stop to that. So we have seen a lot of disruption. We've seen revealed how divisive the Russia question is between the United States and Europe and within Europe itself. We've seen the big PR opportunity for Mr. Putin. And then, of course, some of the outcomes that I think President Biden was hoping to achieve. He had low expectations. The administration keeps using this catchphrase, we just want a stable and reliable relationship. But I think what they mean by that is, please stop putting yourself in the agenda. Please just be good and don't make trouble for us so we can focus on the real problem for the United States, which is China. And I think from the Moscow side, that kind of phraseology, those terms can also be heard as, well, we're going back to business as usual. And clearly the kinds of warnings that President Biden said he delivered to Mr. Putin at their meeting about increasing escalation in the cyber domain have not been heeded. You know, we have seen multiple massive cyber attacks carried out just since mid-June. Of course, these are being attributed to hacker groups operating in Russia, but certainly Russia has a responsibility to reel those in, to identify and prosecute these people. And I don't think there's any interest in that from the Kremlin's perspective. In fact, they're very happy, it seems, to have these kinds of groups operating in Russia's borders. So I think it remains to be seen, but I don't see much desire to come to the table from the Russian side. And unfortunately, I don't think the summit actually accomplished very much in terms of changing the dynamics of the relationship.
So would you say that it was a total waste of time, actually, the summit?
Well, I don't think it was a waste of time. I do think it's good for leaders to meet. But normally, when a summit is organized, it is the finishing touch to a long period of negotiations, leading to some sort of agreement that the two leaders then officially sign up for. We didn't see any of that, so there was nothing on the table. I do think delivering a message directly to Mr. Putin is important, to have the meeting of the two counterparts. Dialogue on military issues is important. I'm not saying that it's not, but why now is the question. Why give Mr. Putin the stage? Also, after President Biden was likely incredibly exhausted after a week of very intense meetings, and President Putin came from Sochi directly, I believe, seemed quite rested, quite comfortable, and President Biden seemed a bit irritated and a bit tired. So I think that the meeting just didn't have to happen now. I would have liked to see the White House actually present what their policy is. We still don't know what the policy is from this White House towards Russia. Then work towards whether that's an agreement on nuclear disarmament, whether that's an agreement on cyber, whether it's an agreement on anything else. But we really just didn't have that kind of preparation go into this. So I think at this time, holding it so early in the administration just didn't accomplish very much for that reason.
Thank you, Alina. I'd now like to turn to you, Fyodor, to put more or less the same question. I mean, what was President Putin's main goal at this summit? Was it, as Alina just mentioned, you know, a PR exercise and nothing more? And how was this summit more broadly viewed in Russia? I mean, the summit itself, and how is the new Biden administration actually viewed in Moscow as well? And just as an add-on, I mean, a few days after the summit, there was the piece from Foreign Minister Lavrov in the Kommersant newspaper. How would you, I mean, how are we supposed to interpret that? I mean, the piece is extremely critical, particularly of the European Union, but not only. I mean, it doesn't seem very, you know, conducive to improving, you know, transatlantic relations.
Yeah, thank you very much, Amanda, and thank you for this invitation. Actually, most of discussions about this summit have been completed already. So it was first weeks after, but maybe it's right to take a time to consider what happened and then to start to discuss. As for Minister Lavrov's article, you know, I think this is much more of his personal reflection of his experience, relationship between him and his European and American counterparts, mainly European probably. So what I know about this article, this was a really very much personal writing. And we see he is disappointed and so on. I would not focus on that as a manifestation of long-term strategy or something else. He is a very experienced person, and sometimes he expresses his view. As for the summit, you know, I'm used all the time when somebody starts to analyze such important things through the lens of PR. Yes, of course, contemporary politics is full of PR, and Americans know it much better than anyone else, because America is a country where politics is, public politics is very much based on PR skills. So in this regard, of course, this element does exist, but it would be, from my point of view, very strange to try to limit such things like summits of two nuclear superpowers to just PR mean. First of all, I think that President Biden, it's strange probably to hear from Moscow, but I think that President Biden did an excellent job during his trip to Europe. Maybe he was tired, but he was very sharp, and he was very good in pursuing goals which he had. And from my point of view, he has a very clear view what he wants to achieve, be it relationship with European allies, relationship with China, or relationship with Russia. And in this regard, this meeting with President Putin, which concluded this trip, was a natural crown of this series of negotiations in London, in Brussels, with NATO, with G7, and so on. I think that Biden knows, as Putin knows, and some other leaders, Xi Jinping maybe, that we have arrived to the new Cold War. This is structurally completely different from the Cold War we knew from the 20th century, but in terms of atmosphere, in terms of public mood, this is very much comparable. From my point of view, the specificity of this moment is that this Cold War suits very much for basically all involved, for different reasons. So I think it's quite obvious to all of us that the previous system of international relations and the previous order, world order, is in flux and will certainly change. And the Cold War, as President Biden formulates that, the free world against the autocratic world, this Cold War is seen on all sides as a pretty comfortable mean to transform everything, to transform international system, which was very much adapted to the previous world composition, and to transform policies of Russia, of China, of the United States. And in this regard, what Biden did during his trip in Europe before meeting Putin, that was very consistent. He forced, as Alina rightly mentioned, China is the biggest problem for the United States. So Biden was very successful, unlike Donald Trump, to force all allies and partners of the United States to this agenda, to anti-Chinese agenda. Russia is part of this because, as I understand, for American leadership is quite important to give an ideological dimension to this confrontation. We hear it from Biden, we hear it from Europeans, value-based approach, and so on. And in this regard, Russia and China build an ideal composition as an enemy, combined, just combined, because Russia per se and China per se might be less convincing to some of partners, but together that's a significant threat. If we believe, if Americans will believe that Russia and China building something like an alliance or a bloc. As for a Russian approach, for other reasons, but the Cold War is okay. For domestic reasons, for international reasons, so we can discuss it if you want. But this Cold War, where actors are different, but potentials are basically the same or even more extended, this Cold War will need a new setup of rules and red lines which should be observed. And I think that for both Biden and Putin, that was very important to identify spheres where danger is present and where those rules should be discussed and elaborated. And they basically started to do it. So Alina said that this summit was a waste of time because nothing was prepared in advance. But I would say it's exactly the opposite. That was absolutely important and necessary to start this work through meeting of presidents. And those declarations which were made about hypothetical joint work on strategic stability and cybersecurity, that's exactly what should be done. And in this regard, I think they send all necessary messages to start this work, to bureaucracies, to military, to experts, and so on. Whether this work will be successful and successfully completed, that's another thing, because as we know from the Cold War time, the first Cold War time, any agreements in a situation of total distrust are being discussed for a long time and demand a lot of very hard work. So we did not do this work for many years, a couple of decades, because no one believed it was necessary. Now we are there. So to conclude, I think that this meeting was good and was important just to identify that we have areas where we should start discussion. Whether it will be successful or not at the end, it remains to be seen, of course.
Thank you, Fyodor. Maybe as an add-on question, I mean, as you rightly said, it's already been like 1 month since the summit took place. I mean, has there been any contacts, further contacts, in terms of setting up working groups or discussions on the various things that were agreed in terms of the strategic dialogue that you know of so far? Or has nothing happened yet? Or do we not just, or we just don't know?
I think we partially we don't know, because in the current political atmosphere, both domestically and internationally, the less public knows, the better sometimes. And in such cases like strategic stability in cybersecurity, the discrete exchange is the only way to achieve something, at least to start. So what I heard is that there are some preparatory discussions about the cybersecurity sphere, and strategic stability, at least on the expert level. I see a clear interest among specialists who felt until this meeting that they were completely abandoned because no one was interested. But now we are back. There is a very complicated thing, because the agenda should be reinvented. The agenda should be changed, because the previous agenda, as we know from the 1960s, unfortunately or fortunately, is completed. So we need a new model. But so far, I didn't hear anything which would derail this process. And this is a big difference to, for example, Putin-Trump meeting 2018, when all agreements or all discussions were abandoned the day after by the American side.
Thank you, Fyodor. Now I'd like to turn to you, Jonathan, actually to get the the EU take, or your take, on how the summit was perceived in Europe. I mean, we saw, as was already mentioned, a sort of an immediate response from Monsieur Macron and Madame Merkel to, I would say, replicate this summit. I mean, they mentioned, talking about a reset in relations. This was obviously not very well received by many of our European member states. So how, I mean, where does EU-Russia relations go from here? And where does transatlantic cooperation on Russia go from here as well? Because if my memory serves me correctly, during the meetings in NATO, but all the G7, and then the event that Biden had with the EU in Brussels, there was a strong hope that there could be more consensus and cooperation on dealing with Russia. But it seems like this is going to be rather difficult.
So let me just pick up a few of the points that Alina and Fyodor mentioned. First, I take a more charitable view of the summit. I actually think that the achievement of the summit is that, first of all, it has refuted or rejected the idea that summits come as a reward for good behavior. The whole argument that you cannot meet with the Russians until the Russians do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I think Biden succeeded in reminding people that summits are also functional structures. I agree with Alina that they need to be prepared, and I agree that a lot of the summits with Russia are the other way around. Namely, the summit is held in the hope that it would lead to an agenda of diplomatic activity, rather than being the apex of a diplomatic activity that has already been conducted. Nevertheless, things are the way they are, and I think that President Biden has succeeded in reversing a rather quite frankly, childish argument that was put during the Trump presidency, which is that mere meeting with the Russian leader was in itself a sign of American weakness or a reward for some alleged bad Russian behavior. I think also Biden succeeded by managing it very well in media terms, avoiding a gladiatorial confrontation. So the kind of press conferences, which Mr. Putin is very good at, the finger-pointing press conferences, the what about press conferences, the rather sloganeering that could happen when two leaders who have to play to their own audiences are together. So the refusal of the American delegation from the beginning to talk about a joint press conference was, I think, quite interesting. And quite successful. So I think in presentational terms, it worked. And now I'm getting to your question about the European Union, Amanda. I think this is where matters did not work well for the American administration. And the answer to Fyodor is that perhaps it's good to talk about it a month after the event. Because the Europeans were consulted, and the president went sort of bent over backwards to consult the Europeans. But the reality is that some of the key Central and East Europeans still felt that they were not consulted. For instance, Poland felt that a lot of the decisions taken about the Nord Stream 2, with the administration deciding to accept Nord Stream 2, were taken without consultation with the Poles. The Ukrainians, for instance, demanded their own separate consultation, which they did not get before the summit. So I think the consultation effort was extensive by the administration, as you pointed out, Amanda, first the G7, then the NATO summit, then the US-EU summit, before the Russia summit. So there was an extensive preparation from Washington, but I think the Americans are discovering what every American president is discovering, which is that no consultation is enough for the European when it comes to these exercises. And secondly, I think that the administration failed to put itself in the position as the voice of the transatlantic community in the summit. It was very much an American voice. So there were some people who looked upon Biden to represent a transatlantic view in the discussions. I think Alina is 100% right. There was a very particular American agenda there for very obvious reasons, and it came across as a very American agenda. And finally, on the question of the strategic stability, where I think the failure is actually quite comprehensive. I know Fyodor is saying that there are some technical discussions. You're absolutely right. There are also a better atmosphere in terms of the diplomatic personnel at the two embassies and at the consulates on two sides. At least we stopped with the tit-for-tat expulsions and restrictions and everything else. So in the technical level, there have been some improvements over the past month. But I think Alina put her finger on the key issue, that there is a very different perception of what strategic stability means between Moscow and Washington. For the United States, or for the current administration, strategic stability means a predictable Russia that does not concern the United States too much, or at least allows the United States to put Russia in a particular box so that it could deal with matters that are more pressing for the United States at the moment. That would be the ideal strategic stability. While for the Kremlin, the strategic stability is a much more complex issue, which involves Russia's place in Europe, Russia's place in a global security system, and of course, Russia's recognition of Russia's spheres of influence and weight in the European scene. So in many respects, the dialogue about the strategic stability turned out to be a bit of a dialogue of the deaf, and I think it would remain a dialogue of the deaf. So I think on the presentational side, the summit, I agree with Fyodor, the summit was actually, I think, quite a bit of a success. and for both sides, because it removed some of the fundamental psychological handicaps about meeting. But I don't think it was a success for American diplomacy, although I acknowledge for American diplomacy in Europe. Because if you look at what Mr. Macron has said immediately thereafter, was that if we agree for the Americans talking on our behalf, then of course we must talk ourselves without the Americans, with the Russians as well. The sort of keeping up with the Joneses, which is a very European argument, you know, we have to keep up with the Americans or be as good as the Americans, immediately came up. So in that respect, despite all the good efforts, I think the administration failed in its European objectives.
Thank you, Jonathan. Just to stay with you for a bit longer on the EU. I mean, the EU released a few weeks ago its new communique on Russia, where it has this, you know, now well-known slogan, you know, contain, engage, and push back. Frankly speaking, I'm not entirely sure what that really means, or if they know what it means. And also, we've seen that the EU actually came up again at the last summit with one of these, you know, Russia to-do lists before they will engage with the Russians in any sort of summit. I mean, if you had to give the EU, you know, a piece of advice now on how they should actually be engaging with Russia, what would that be? Because it seems to me that there's a total lack of unity, or a lack of a single policy going forward.
Well, what I would say, first of all, and I'm sure my colleagues will have plenty to say on this as well, but what I would say is that the Franco-German link is absolutely destructive to European cohesiveness and achieves absolute zero. In fact, the more this link pushes for a dialogue with Russia without any definition about what it means and without any process of consultation, the more the discussion is going to go bad. Now, I am prepared to accept that Mrs. Merkel means well, that she does want a predictable relationship with Russia for a variety of reasons. But the way to go about it is to try to forge a consensus in Europe, and most importantly, not to treat the Central and East Europeans as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. The whole raison d'etre for the Franco-German initiative is to assume that they are the only ones who know how to deal with Russia. They are the grown-ups in the room, while all the rest need to be told what they need to follow. It is a fundamentally misconceived idea, and it doesn't serve Russia either. It doesn't achieve anything for Russia either. You mentioned the last summit. Well, they spent a whole evening over dinner basically discussing a Franco-German proposal, which everyone knew was dead in the water from the beginning. The real puzzle is why the French and the Germans decided to put it forward anyway, and why the secrecy, and why the subterfuges, and why subsequently Mr. Macron still had a phone call with Mr. Putin, to which he referred to a structured strategic dialogue, which nobody knows what it actually means. So I think that Europe is in disarray, and you mentioned the policy paper, which is quite frankly a lot of cliches strung together. I think it's a disarray. I do think we need a serious discussion about Russia, but I do think that unless the discussion is inclusive, with especially the countries which are nearest to Russia having a voice in this discussion, it will be a nugatory one. So I would say the first advice is go back to basics, sit down and start talking without preconceived ideas within the European Union about what you can do.
Thank you, Jonathan. I totally agree with you. But now I would like to come back to you, Alina. I mean, how was this, you know, Merkel, Macron debacle viewed in Washington? That would be my first question. And the second question would be, again, related to this issue of the dialogue on strategic stability. As we just heard, I mean, the views of what strategic stability is seem to be quite different from if you view it from Moscow or you view it from Washington. So can we say that this is sort of more or less dead in the water before we even start? I mean, how difficult will it be to start a discussion on this if the views on what it means are so far apart?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that I very much agree with Jonathan just laid out in terms of what's happening within Europe on Russia policy. And I think the debacle, as you called it, Amanda, the German-French initiative to push through a restart of a dialogue with Russia at the EU level without any consultations. It came out as a leak in the Financial Times, I think within 24 hours before the actual meeting was going to take place. And it really took many EU member states who were not consulted about this by surprise. And we saw some of the strongest statements, of course, come out from the countries that are most concerned about Russian military aggression against their own territories, obviously the Baltic states and Poland being top of mind there. I find it very interesting as well, and I'd love to hear those of you joining from London, if you might agree or vehemently disagree with what I'm about to say, which is that it seems to me that the UK in some ways is now more aligned in terms of its policy with countries like Estonia and Poland when it comes to Russia than France and Germany. And that's a very interesting development. So I think, to my mind, the recent event, this Merkel-Macron idea to broker an EU-wide dialogue, as a colleague of mine said, these are not my words, a colleague of mine recently said that he thought this looked a bit like penis envy from Germany and France, where, well, the Americans had this meeting with Putin, why can't we? But of course, you can't do that when you're pushing through an agenda that's supposed to represent the views of the entire bloc. So I think we're seeing an interesting new alliance, if you want to call it that, or an affinity of views emerge between the post-Brexit UK and some of the Baltic/Central Eastern European states, which is drawing them closer together on the Russia agenda. But I also think that the administration, the US administration, was trying to broker a deal on China. And that was really the focus of all these meetings in Europe. And also extending a bit of olive branch to Russia was very much part of that, because of course we've seen where some German opinion has stood on the Russia question for a very long time, is much more open to collaboration, to economic relationship building, things of that nature. Obviously, Nord Stream 2 was a big gift to the German relationship, which continues to be seen as something that was quite shocking in Central Eastern Europe and the Baltic states, and certainly in Ukraine, which I think rightfully saw this as a bit of a betrayal of US commitment to Ukraine in its fight against continued Russian aggression on Ukraine's territory. So I think, to my mind, this was another Borrell-like, if you remember the incident with Joseph Borrell's visit to Moscow and how criticized he was for literally being embarrassed during an open press conference by his counterpart, Foreign Minister Lavrov. And this was another one of these incidents where I think French and German officials try to push forward a certain agenda without any consultation with their European allies. And again, I just think this was a complete disaster. I think your point on strategic stability and what Jonathan said, and your point that what that means to one side is very different than what it means to the other side. I think that's exactly right. I do think that these talks, however, are important. Even during the Soviet era, we had dialogue, we had communication on the core issues where the two countries at the time could have come in direct conflict with each other. And we do need to reinstate those. It's good to have meetings, especially at the military level. It's good to have dialogue and open channels of communication at the diplomatic level. Reestablishing those normal diplomatic relations is going to be very key in the months ahead. So if the summit was able to accomplish that, I do think that would be a small step forward. But do I expect these strategic stability talks to actually lead to some something new, a reformulation of the relationship, which is exactly right. I think Fyodor put this out there, that we need to be thinking of a new model. I'm very skeptical. I mean, Mr. Putin has been in power for over 20 years. We have seen a very specific kind of approach to the West emerge in Russia under his rule, and I don't think that's going to change. There have been many presidents that Mr. Putin himself has not met with and dealt with, and I don't think from the Russian perspective they see this administration as really one they're going to deal with for very long. And who knows what's going to happen in our elections in 2024. It could have we could once again elect a very different kind of president. And so I think from the Russian side, it's to really wait and see, as they've always done. But unfortunately, I think we're just in this paralysis, where there's little desire from the Russian side to come to the table on some core issues like Crimea, obviously, like the Donbass, like cyber operations. And I think from the US side, the focus is shifting very, very, very quickly to the Indo-Pacific, and they just really want to park Russia to the side.
Thank you, Alina. Fyodor, would you agree with Alina about relations being in some sort of paralysis now? Would you agree with that? And would you also agree with there's not much that opportunity for moving the strategic dialogue forward, given the divergences between the two sides? And my third question at this point would be to ask you, I mean, how is, the European Union now perceived in Moscow? I mean, does it give a damn about, the top brass? I mean, Michel, von der Leyen, what they have to say, or they simply don't give a damn? And for Russia, is it all about still enhancing relations with national capitals?
Yeah, first of all, frankly, I'm a little bit confused about statements by Alina and by Jonathan about strategic stability, because maybe I'm too narrow, but as I remember, strategic stability is not a description of international situation, relationship in different areas. Strategic stability is a special term related to a very particular relationship between nuclear powers and nuclear superpowers. And the core of strategic stability is to establish and to maintain rules of behavior in this field. How to make still existing mutually assured destruction work and never be, so to say, implemented. This is strategic stability, and this is what Putin and Biden spoke about. And this is the area where they agreed to start discussions. And when I say about the new model, I mean exactly this. I don't mean broader negotiations about Ukraine or Venezuela or Syria or whatever. That's all those issues are important and interesting, but don't belong to the sphere of strategic stability. Strategic stability was invented as a discipline, was invented in the 1960s after Cuban Missile Crisis, just in order to make both parts operate in a way that they will never destroy each other. And that model, which was developed in 60s and 70s, was actually very good and very, very efficient, but now situation changed. So we cannot just expect that treaties like New START or previous starts can be signed again, because as US administration rightly points out, there are very many new factors, be it hypersonic, be it cyber, be everything, so you know that. And that's exactly what we should discuss, because what is the main responsibility of Russia and the United States in international relations? Exactly this, as being two nuclear superpowers, we need to settle this issue, to come up with this new scheme. It's not about an agreement yet, it's about a scheme, how all those new factors can be taken into account. And I think actually that is very much possible to launch this discussion. We don't know whether the new scheme will be achieved soon, because it's objectively very difficult. As for the rest, as I mentioned at the beginning, we are in the atmosphere of the Cold War, and the Cold War means that all controversies should be addressed in a special way. So just to expect on the American side that Russia will take the list of demands and then change its behavior, it doesn't work. It's bad or good, it's another discussion, but it doesn't work. And no one can achieve this on the American side and should not expect on the Russian side to follow. But in each particular case, I think it's possible to at least to discuss some red lines and some rules. So if this new atmosphere, which started to emerge after the summit, will continue, then I think we can expect some improvements at certain areas. But it will not change the general situation that we are in the middle of global transformation, general transformation of all international system. And the Cold War as a mean is basically accepted by all sides. So we will not, we should not expect a lot of cooperation. We should expect a lot of efforts to minimize risks.
Thank you very much, Fyodor. I'd now like to take a few of the questions from the chat box. I want to start with the one from Ignacio Perez, who is basically asking, can we expect a change in German and EU policy towards Russia following Angela Merkel's imminent departure? Maybe I can give that one to you, Jonathan.
It's difficult to know because it will depend very much on who the makeup of a new German government. If, for instance, a new German government still has Mr. Laschet, Armin Laschet, the putative successor to Angela Merkel, then I think you will find a policy that will be very similar. He belongs to the school of thought that sort of sees relationship with Russia as a question of gratitude for the Germans, for the German unification. He also is on record as insisting on a very close coordination with France on foreign policy questions. And so I think that the chances are very high that until the elections in France, which take place, of course, in a year from now, there will be very little change in the position. Of course, matters change completely if there is a complete change of government in Berlin, namely if the figures don't work out with a Christian Democrat as chancellor. What I would say, however, is that the discussion about policy towards Russia is a very big discussion now in Berlin. And I think German diplomats are aware that they are beginning to lose the attention of a lot of Central and East European countries, and are aware that they are losing reputation with a lot of these countries. So you will see when the chancellor, the current chancellor, gets to Washington, which I think is next week, that one of the discussions will be reassuring the Central Europeans about the impact of Nord Stream 2, with a variety of things, like, for instance, allowing flow of natural gas to go in both directions and therefore prevent any shortages for the new member states. I think it's quite interesting that the same chancellor that said that Nord Stream is a purely economic project is now rushing to offer political assurances after the pipeline is completed. But the Germans know that they're losing ground, especially in one half of Europe, with their policy. Whether that's enough for it to be changed is another matter. The political elite, from President Steinmeier to Mr. Laschet, seems to still adhere to the policy of Angela Merkel.
Thank you, Jonathan. I have a question here from Hemanga Moral, who's asking, do you agree that the aggressive policies and sanctions by the US and the EU on Russia are pushing Russia towards China. Maybe I can ask you, Alina, and you, Fyodor, to comment on that one.
Well, thank you. I think certainly some of the sanctions policies have likely contributed to what was already an ongoing trend in Russian foreign policy towards forming a closer partnership, economic partnership with China. I think the Kremlin very much sees China as the rising power, as many in the United States obviously do as well, and see much more aligned in terms of some ideological perspectives about the world with Beijing, obviously, versus, let's say, Berlin, Paris, or Washington. I don't think the sanctions themselves prompted this pivot, if we want to call it that. That has been an ongoing part of the strategic desire to build a closer relationship. But certainly some of the sanctions, I think on the financial side in particular, especially in terms of access to particular kinds of credit lines, have likely prompted a desire to look to China to fill some of those financing gaps. And certainly it's perhaps accelerated the pace of that growing relationship. I, on the other hand, do remain rather skeptical that Russia-China relationship is a proper alliance in the making. I think it's quite superficial if we take a closer look at it, and doesn't have the long-term kind of staying power of what we would consider an alliance of some kind. But certainly trade has been increasing, cooperation in defense and science and technology has been increasing. But I think the sanctions contribute to that, but they certainly didn't drive it. They weren't the initial catalyst behind this trend.
Okay, and maybe have your views on this as well, Fyodor, because I think in Russia's new national security strategy, I mean, China, the importance of China is mentioned there quite strongly.
I would say in the new Russian national security strategy, the most striking thing is that international relations in general are much less emphasized than before. So Russia is much more inward looking, as many other countries as well, but in our case, it's pretty new. As for China, I don't believe that anybody expects an alliance. Neither Russia nor China are countries which are well situated to get engaged in alliances, because any alliance means that you limit your freedom of actions because of your partner. And this is not part of Russian political culture, is not part of Chinese political culture. So there is no need. And of course, the nature of challenges to China and Russia are certainly very much different. At the same time, I think the partnership is pretty strong. There are no reasons to believe that this partnership might be disrupted by anything in the foreseeable future. American policy is contributing to that, but I would agree it's not the main trigger. And even if we disregard Russian relationship with the West, I think the biggest challenge to Russia for years, if not decades to come, is to build up a very strong but very much balanced relationship with China, because China is the biggest neighbor. China is one of the most powerful international actors, and it would be simply crazy not to have excellent relationship with this kind of actor, while having all possible counterbalances. And that's why, for example, Russian relationship with India is extremely important. But in general, this, I wouldn't overestimate some particular events and actions, because we see a profound transformation of international system, and a lot of Russian moves are not, so to say, are defined by this change. Russia is trying to adapt to them, and this pivot to Asia is one of those moves.
Thank you. I'd now like to give the floor to my colleague Ionela, who has a question. So if you could unmute her, Natalie, that would be great. Hopefully she's there. Yeah.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for
Hello.
all your insightful and thought-provoking ideas. My question is for all of you. We already discussed about how the situation is nowadays in the relation between Washington and the Kremlin, but also in the relation between Brussels and Moscow. But I'm curious about your thoughts on what are the areas of potential cooperation between Washington and Moscow, and what role can you play in these issues? How can we de-escalate a little bit the actual conflict? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe this time we'll start with you, Fyodor, then go back around to Alina at the end.
Russian relationship with Europe has an extended background since collapse of the Soviet Union, creation of the European Union, and that was probably the most ambitious relationship ever in Russian political history, because at the beginning, both sides assumed, as it turned out in different way, but assumed that Russia should become part of something, not the European Union, of course, but something like a greater Europe, big Europe. So we could never identify this entity, but it was, so to say, accepted by both sides and by the Russian side as well, that Russia should be part of a European world. It didn't happen, and I don't believe it was possible, because it was a utopian goal, although very sincerely followed at a certain moment. And since that, I think this relationship is, on the one hand, pretty unfortunate because of feeling of illusions which we lost, on the one hand. On the other hand, when I listened to the previous debate of my esteemed colleagues, I think it's a little bit strange to discuss what Europe, that Europeans should sit down and discuss seriously what Europe should be done with Russia. I think the European problem now is pretty different. It's not about sit down and discuss Russia. It's sit down to this and discuss what will be in the European Union in 5, 10, 15 years time, because it's quite obvious looking from the outside that the European Union will go through very difficult, very profound transformation. It cannot be preserved as it used to be in 20th century or beginning of this century. And this is much more important, how relationship between states will be formed, what kind of groups, what kind of interests will be prevailing. That's absolutely needed for Europe. It's not our business, it's not Russian business at all. But before its job will be done, it's quite strange to start with Russia. Russia is not the defining factor for the future of Europe. And as for Russian relationship with European countries, yes, I believe that exactly because of this burden of the recent past, a relationship with the European Union as an institution is very much complicated, because we see at least remaining attempts to refer to this previous model, which is perdu, which is not existing anymore. And in this situation, especially given the fact that, as I said, European Union is in the process of transformation, of course, working with particular countries is much easier and much more, much clearer. At the same time, of course, there are big limitations, because those countries, they have limited capacity to define their policies because they are members of the European Union. I think at the end of the day that we need a period of reflection in Europe about Europe, and reflection in Russia about Russia, not about our relationship. And after that, we will come to a point when we understand what Europe wants vis-a-vis Russia, maybe one day, and what Russia wants vis-a-vis Europe, but it will not happen tomorrow. As long as we preserve economic ties and technical ties on the current level, I think it's fine.
Thank you, Fyodor. Now, Alina, give the
Just a quick comment on the future of the relationship, which I think was where you started with this question, Amanda, with this really fantastic conversation. I mean, I think this discussion has also shown to me that there's a huge amount of disagreement about just the basic ideas of where we see the relationship heading, how we interpret certain events, certainly the meanings of Putin and Biden as well as others. And I think to my mind, that's why it's so important to be able to have these kinds of conversations on a more regular basis. So I think going forward, again, I don't see a lot of changes coming in the US-Russia relationship, but I certainly hope that we can at least reestablish some research connections, people-to-people connections, so we can have these kinds of discussions, so we can come to a better understanding of where each side stands and how each side sees the world, because I think that is the piece that's been really lacking over the last several years, and certainly since 2014. So this doesn't mean that we go back to business as usual, that we forget about Ukraine, that we forget about some of the other Russian activities across the world that undermine US interests, that undermine our own societies in various ways. But I think it's so critical for us to start to come to some middle ground from at least the research side, the civil society side, so we can better understand each other, because that will be the beginning point for a better and I think more productive relationship in the future, when governments will eventually change in both countries.
Thank you, Alina. And some final comments from you, Jonathan.
I think Fyodor was right to sort of talk about the history of our relationship. But of course, the European Union of today is not the European Union that engaged in the utopian discussions of the 1960s and the 1970s. It's no longer the Gaullist creation from Paris, although some people in Paris seem to have forgotten that one. It is no longer an association of 6 countries. It is no longer an association of 12 countries which still dreamt of being a power between the United States and Soviet Union or Russia. And of course, views, as you know, Fyodor, have changed in Moscow as well, from the Brezhnev idea that somehow the EU can weaken NATO, to sometimes the feeling that the EU is an additional problem on Russian foreign policy. So that's why I said we need a discussion inside the European Union. It doesn't need to be, you know, running foreign policy is not like running an academic seminar. So I'm not suggesting that we sit all day and discuss this question. There are some very practical issues on which we do need cooperation with Russia. We do need cooperation with Russia on counterterrorism. We do need cooperation with Russia on border controls and immigration, and on manufactured immigration crises like the expulsions from Belarus into Poland and Lithuanian borders. We do need a discussion about climate change, of course. So there is a number of areas where we do need a discussion, but we do need that discussion to be in total inside the European Union. And yes, we may need a different view in Moscow as well, within MID in Moscow, about whether they are content in dealing with a union of 27 states, or whether they are quite happy to deal with France and Germany, and occasionally, I don't know, Hungary or other outliers like that. Because if that's the case, we're not going to go very far. But actually, the reality, and this is, I agree 100% with Fyodor, there's actually quite a lot to discuss. And there's actually quite a strong will to discuss. And it's not true that the countries of Central and Eastern Europe are Russophobes. I think they will be the first to agree that if the relationship between Russia and Europe goes very badly, they are the first ones to suffer. So I just think it is a discussion or in Europe, and it is a problem for the Europeans, for Paris and Berlin in particular, to accept that the union as it has been enlarged is a very different union from the one created by Konrad Adenauer and Charles de Gaulle in the late 50s.
If I may, just one sentence. I'm a little bit.
Yeah, if it's very quick. Yeah.
Yeah. Alina mentioned a couple of times business as usual. It's no way to go back to business as usual. I'm afraid it's wrong perception, because there is no usual anymore. What kind of business of usual we can imagine? So the usual has gone. So we need to come to either to a new business or to a new something else. Usual has come forever.
Okay, thank you so much. We've reached the end of this webinar. I think we had a very interesting discussion. There was many issues that we could continue to discuss for much longer, but I mean, we all need to go and do other things. So I would like to thank all of you really a lot for joining us today. I know you're all very busy people with busy agendas, so thank you for coming and sharing this conversation with us. Your insights were really valuable. Thank you very much as well to our audience for joining us today and listening to this conversation. There's always going to be a huge appetite for events and conversations about Russia, Russian foreign policy, domestic policy. It's never ending. So needless to say, the EPC will be continuing to track very closely what happens in and around Russia in terms of events and in publications. We'll be having a break now for the summer, but we'll be back in September, starting off looking at around the parliamentary elections. Well, I'm sure we know the results already, but still we'll be tracking that. So again, many thanks for everybody for joining us today. And I wish you a great afternoon, evening, or in your case, Alina, the rest of your morning. Thank you.